If you've ever wondered whether that passion project really is entrepreneurial gold worth fighting for, or a hobby that should just stay in your garage, this episode is for you. Today, we talk with CEO and founder Mark Frank of Sondermind and investor Curt Roberts to give you both sides of a perfect pitch. What is Perfect Pitch, you ask? Well, it's a podcast from Kickstart that reveals the minds of both investors and entrepreneurs throughout a startup's journey. Whether it's uncovering what everyone's thinking during a startup pitch or digging into exactly how entrepreneurs have managed their first major roadblock, Perfect Pitch is an honest, quick, and tactical guide to help you on your startup journey. I'm your host, Karen Zelnick, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's guests. First, our investor, Curt Roberts from Kickstart. He's a former CEO and Nike exec. And Curt, how many pairs of shoes do you have at this point?
200 and something, 2 closets, plus a good portion of the garage.
I personally just really think you can't have too many shoes, Curt, just like you can't have too many hobbies. Besides his investment focus on consumer products, health tech, ed tech, and general B2B SaaS in the West, Curt is also crazy about cycling, skiing, photography, and collecting rare antiquarian books.
That's true. Thank you.
And I've seen his photography. His photography is amazing. So I think he should have a website up, but that's just me. And then our CEO is Mark Frank. He's the CEO and co-founder of Sondermind, which is redesigning behavioral health to be more accessible, approachable, and utilized. You were an Army officer for 5 years, is that correct? And you earned the Bronze Star during your time in Iraq?
Yes.
That's amazing. Anything else that I missed or that you'd like to cover?
I suffered through a couple of years of investment banking with Morgan Stanley.
Okay.
And
that's suffering, all right.
That's right. I had a tour of duty in the Army and then a tour of duty post-business school.
Thank you. Well, thanks for joining us, both of you. And if you want to know more about Curt or Mark or Sondermind, we'll have more info on our show notes at kickstartfund.com. So let's just dive right into the discussion. Mark, I'd love to know what inspired the passion behind Sondermind. Like, why did you start the company?
Yeah, so the founding story is an interesting one. I was running my first startup, my first company, which was a radiation oncology company treating patients with brain tumor, lung cancer, prostate cancer. And we were a management service organization as well called Next Oncology. And in the midst of that, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, had been passed, and there was a lot of change going on in healthcare. But besides that, I was viewing my younger sister as a mental health provider go into private practice. While she brought with her some clients, she was ultimately really dismayed at how difficult it was for her to start her practice, to continue to grow it, and build her client base and deal with all the administrative hurdles and things like that. And so I had this nugget in the back of my head. I had, like I mentioned, I was running Next Oncology. I had started Safe Image MD, which was the second company on the side at the time. And so I didn't have the bandwidth to sort of try on another thing, but I had this sort of nugget of an idea. Fast forward a few years, and I was in the space of needing to find a therapist and went on the insurance directory, looked for a provider, and put in my zip code and put in behavioral health provider and checked the box because there was a little box that says accepting new patients, and out pops a list. I go, great. So I'll just go with the first one and call her. She doesn't answer. I leave a message. I wait a few days. I don't get a call back. And so I call again and leave another message. Wait a couple more days. Don't get a call back. Call the next person on the list. Same thing. Yeah. Finally, somebody I'm talking to. Yeah. But the answer is, actually, I'm not taking clients anymore. And, the next one was like, I don't deal with those issues or whatever. I'm not in that office space anymore. I'm now in another part of town, and just on it went. And it was so frustrating. And I remember thinking at the time, like, thank God I'm not, in a place where it's like crisis. And I remember thinking, this must be so challenging for people. And oh, by the way, I knew the insurance system. Like we were a contracted provider. I had a billing manager and people in my company that dealt with insurance. I mean, I knew this better than the average bear. And it was still difficult for me. And even beyond that, when we finally started seeing a therapist, the therapist was great. The clinical care was amazing. But the experience around it was still challenging. And I just kept thinking, why is this so hard for this really, really important facet of our healthcare system? And then I started thinking more about my sister's side, and well, wow, they're struggling too. It's like you peel the onion and you start going, wow, like this really is a problem. And that's where it was like, there's a structural inefficiency in how we've been dealing with mental health and behavioral health for the past 30 years, where ultimately there's this opportunity to kind of solve both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I love that you can just sense how passionate you are about solving this issue. Curt, as an investor, was that passion clearly evident when you first met Mark? And is that one of the reasons that you were interested in the company and interested in looking and investing in it?
Yeah, we really love entrepreneurs that have some sense of a cause behind what they're doing. And there are some times where those causes are things that most people wouldn't particularly care about, where the cause is interesting to the individual starting the company, but wouldn't be interesting to most people. This was a case where not only was it a cause for Mark, but it's something that everybody should care that it works better and that organizations do a good job of making healthcare in a behavioral health setting more accessible, more approachable, better utilized, and higher quality. And these were things that we saw in Mark and Mark's team that really drew us to the company.
And there might be people listening who want to start a company, but they don't feel as much passion around their startup. So is that necessary?
I can go first if you want, Karen. I think it is. I may have a different feeling about this than some investors, but I think it's a given that an entrepreneur is going to be someone who has a very high work ethic, that is willing to work through obstacles, is willing to fight through difficulties, not take no for an answer. Those kinds of characteristics are a given. What's different about someone who has a significant passion about their startup is that person ultimately defines himself or herself by the problem they're trying to solve. And I think in the worst of times, that's what gets that person through. I remember an experience when Mark and I were getting close to finishing our funding round. We weren't quite ready to close yet. And I remember Mark telling me, and he's an extremely open person, which is something that I really admire. I remember him telling me that he was basically asking all of his staff to skip pay periods and to cut salaries so that the company could make it through to the time when we would actually fund. That's the kind of thing I think that differentiates between someone who really cares about the thing they're trying to solve versus the person who just wants to be an entrepreneur. That's a difference that matters.
I think that's very insightful. Mark, do you have thoughts on that too?
I do. I think, so I would agree with everything Curt said. And I would say that it's not necessarily the case, in my opinion, that you'd be passionate about the specific problem. I believe you have to have a real reason of why you're oriented towards solving the problem you're solving. But I also think that you can create your own passion from a kernel of initial passion. So you can build upon it. I used to have this idea that entrepreneurs always had this, the light bulb kind of idea. And it was like, and then that just became their driving force. At least for me, more often it's been this it builds and builds. And then at a certain point, you're like, oh my God, it's just, the light bulb was more of the building in your face. And for me, that happened in, kind of 2013, 2014.
Yeah, I just want to maybe expand on that though, Mark. There's an investor that I worked with significantly earlier in my career when I was just investing my own personal money. And I wasn't part of Kickstart. So this was not my profession. And I didn't really know what I was doing. And I was talking to this guy who's done a lot of investing before. And he said to me once something that's never left my mind. He said, every startup goes through at a minimum 2 near-death experiences. When I heard him say that, I thought, okay, what gives an entrepreneur the drive to get past the first one and past the second one and possibly past additional ones that might go beyond that point? And if you're someone who just has 3 to 4 great ideas of companies that might be started, you might decide, hey, this one, honestly, we gave it our best shot. Let's move on. I've got another one that's really great, right? And what intrigued me about your story in this one is that you had very, very personal experiences in your own family life that spoke to me in a way that said, Mark will not give up until this is done. That made a big difference in my interest in Kickstart investing in your company, especially given that when we started, at least there were some complications in how the company was set up. and some things we had to solve. And so I knew it was going to be a longer, more involved process to finish an investment than it might be with some companies. And that kind of gave me the drive to want to do that with you.
I think that's fair. And I'm a non-professional angel investor as well, and I haven't done much angel investing in the past three or 4 years. But for a little bit, I was making 2 or 3 investments a year, and the ones that have been successful marry with what you're saying, that where there's some level of personal passion.
I loved that. I loved that back and forth. And I think that was a really insightful discussion for those that are listening. And I think the next question I have then is, what is the litmus test, or is there even a litmus test when passion will work to build a great company, or if it should just stay a hobby or a garage project? Because Curt, I'm sure that there have been people that have come and pitched to you, and it's like, they're not going to give up on this, but it's also not a great startup idea. So what's the litmus test?
Well, what I would say is every company that we wish to invest in has to pass certain tests of being an attractive opportunity. The market has to be big enough. The solution has to be significantly better than anything currently available. There are all those things that you could read in any book or in any blog that would say, this is a company worth investing in. There's something about listening to that founder tell their story that gives you a sense that the person has some larger idea in mind, on the assumption that it passes all the rest of the tests, right? We see probably 500 startups per year, and we fund less than 1% of those. And so for us, those small differences on the margin make all the difference in whether we want to join that entrepreneur for the journey.
Yeah, thank you. So passion isn't always enough.
It's not always enough. Everything else is a given. For me, it's that passion, that cause element, is that small thing on the margin that says, okay, I am more willing to take this risk than I would be if that were not there.
And now I want to segue a little bit, because Curt, you mentioned something earlier about like the initial journey with Sondermind being a little bit rough in the beginning. So it's not like it was like you found your passion and we knew it was a good idea, and then it was like smooth sailing. Could you both talk a little bit about what that was like for each of you on the beginning of the relationship there?
From my perspective, Mark had immediate credibility coming into pitch Kickstart because he was a classmate of Gavin Christensen, who's the founder of our fund. And so he had an advantage walking in the door. There were 2 things I saw after hearing the pitch, besides the fact that I thought it was a really interesting opportunity. That were 2 things that I knew we would have to deal with. One is the pitch itself was not great. Mark did a great job of...
I don't argue it.
But you were very passionate.
but honestly, the pitch itself had way too much content in it, and there was no clear story, and it was kind of muddled, and it meandered around. And, most of the time for me, that's a sign that says, hey, this person might have trouble raising money. And maybe that's enough of a sign alone that we shouldn't fund. Yeah. In Mark's case, I suspected there was more to the story. And so it didn't feel to me like something that I should ignore. The second thing was that Sondermind had started as both a real estate and a software company. And we had no interest in being part of a real estate company. So I had a decision to make early. Do I want to start a conversation with Mark about the difficult process of separating these 2 companies and figuring out how the ownership of those 2 will put us in a position where we can align our interests behind the software company? Sondermind understood that therapists oftentimes practice out of their living rooms. They don't have places where they can do private practice. And so the idea was to create a WeWork for mental health therapists. Great idea, right? I think it's a brilliant idea. We didn't want to fund that idea. We wanted to be behind the software company. And since those 2 were in a single organization, we had to make the decision of whether we wanted to invest the time to work with Mark to figure out whether those 2 could be separated, and if Mark was willing to go there and go through the hard steps to get to that outcome.
Mark, what was that like for you?
Yeah, so similarly, my co-founder, Sean, and I had started the business with again, addressing this bigger problem. And the way we started it, to Curt's point, was this kind of we work for therapy model. And actually, to add another complication around making it less VC backable, we structured it as a franchisor, meaning the specific locations, generally speaking, would be owned by franchisees, which is, I still believe, is a great way to fund a capital-intensive business.
True.
But one that almost to a T, venture capitalists do not back. And so Curt and I started really engaging in the time when, we were just before we had legally separated, but we hadn't started the operational separation. And that took about a year, a little less than a year. Yep. Half of that time was post Kickstart's initial investment. And so it was a step-by-step process, but it was this realization that, while these two problems, they are definitely synergistic, they are also very different in terms of the type of capital that's needed, the ability to scale, and then just the people. I mean, that's one of the most important things in building a company, is bringing the right people on board. And so the type of people you would recruit and hire for, building a mental health marketplace that's focusing on, working with insurance companies and things like that, and health systems, those are very different people, generally speaking, than who you necessarily want to hire for a franchisor that is a we work for therapists kind of offering.
That's absolutely right.
That was one of the areas where it was super helpful to have Curt involved in that, because there was, an outsider point of view that was able to say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? In terms of how are you going to operationalize this splitting of the company?
Thank you. So this has been really enlightening. And now what I want to ask both of you, because I think the people listening would love to know, what is something you wish you'd understood and known at the beginning of this pitch process? Like, what do you wish you could go back and tell your earlier self, Mark?
One of the things was to do a better job painting the picture. I was raising money in the midst of a transition. You're always in transition as a startup, but when you're literally in transition of like completely changing the organization, it wasn't a pivot, but it was like, hey, we have, 3% of our revenue is the business that Kickstart ended up backing, and 97% of the revenue is the thing we're getting rid of. And now we're like separating out. And so trying to speak to that, what I could have done a better job of was really painting the vision. This is what it will look like. This is what, as opposed to focusing on here's what it looks like now, is say what you're going to invest in is the thing that it's going to look like in 6 months, in a year and a half. I think I could have done a better job of that.
Yeah. Curt, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I would say entrepreneurs are always put in a difficult spot, in the sense that they oftentimes get conflicting advice. I was on the phone with an entrepreneur this morning who's pitched us on his idea, and it's a really interesting idea. And I talked to him about the size of the investment round he was trying to raise, and I gave him some thoughts about how I would think about that. His comment to me as soon as I talked to him was, that's exactly the opposite of what other people told me. This is not an uncommon problem. And I think here's what each person that's starting a company and building a company has to decide. At some point, that person decides that he or she wants to cast their lot with someone that they feel can help them build the company together. And in Mark's case, that was a non-trivial choice, because not only was he separating this real estate company from the software company, but I was asking him to make some very significant changes in the ownership structure of both of those. That with this co-founder, that they would shift stock between each other. And I knew those conversations would be incredibly sensitive, and that those would have to happen before we actually closed the investment. So I knew Mark was really placing a lot of faith in me, that we weren't going to just ask him to do all these hard things and then bail, at the last minute. That kind of a sense of your partner, from an investor to the entrepreneur and from the entrepreneur to the investor, is something that I think gets established relatively early in the relationship, and it shapes everything that happens thereafter. And I think once that trust is established, really great things can happen. But lacking that trust, it's incredibly difficult to navigate that journey.
thank you both. I think those are some really amazing insights. And for those of you who are listening, hopefully you're taking notes and that you'll come back to this episode and listen to it on repeat. Mark, I did want to close with a question to you. And again, for those listening, take some notes because Curt has often described Mark as like one of the best CEOs out there. So Mark, I would love to know if you could go back to your first year self, like back to your first startup, now that you've done 4, what is something you would tell yourself about the process of entrepreneurship?
Wow. Listening to your gut, particularly around people, particularly around hires. To hire the right person, you have to spend the appropriate time to define what it is you're really looking for. And if, there's a great book called The A Method of Hiring or something to that effect, that actually lays it out pretty well. But just in summary, it's make sure that you know exactly what the problem is you're trying to solve. And I often coach some of my team members around, hey, it's great to think about what's the problem we need to solve now. When you're in a startup, it's like, there's a million problems to solve. So you can think of, hey, I need to hire somebody to do X, Y, and Z because we need that done in the next 3 to 6 months. But typically when you're hiring somebody, you're not thinking about that they're only going to be there for 3 to 6 months. You're thinking they're going to be there, and the more senior, the more important this is, you're thinking they're going to be there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And so it's defining what does success in this role look like a year and a half out, and not just success, not just meeting the bar. If I could just come up with the absolute best person to fill this role, and how would they be the best at it? And then work backwards from that and shoot for that goal. That's gonna do a lot for you in the hiring process. And then once you've hired somebody, the adage is often hire slow, fire fast, right? And that's something that, I think you have to really, as an entrepreneur in a fast moving organization, you have to take to heart. Firing doesn't necessarily mean firing from the company too. I want to make that clear. Sometimes you could hire the right person, they could be a great cultural fit, and you put them in the wrong job. You put them in the wrong spot. So it's on you as the leader to make sure that you find the right role for them. So fire them from their current job, find another job for them in your company. We've done that with a number of very successful mid-level people in our company where we just didn't put them in the right place for success. But it boils down to, for the entrepreneur, this is your vision, and you know better than anybody else, especially in the early days, what success looks like. And just trust, if you're pretty certain that somebody is not the right fit, you have to make that call because it's really, really hard. But if you don't do that, the organization is going to suffer just materially. And you can't be afraid of making those hard decisions.
Yeah, I love that. I love that this speaks so much to your passion. Like we were talking about earlier, that it permeates every aspect of it. It's not just the vision of the company, but it's your vision for the people in the company and hiring from the gut. And I love that. Thank you. And Curt, did you have any thoughts on that?
It's funny to what Mark said. Early in my career, I made the transition. He made the transition from Army to investment banking back to managing teams and people. I went from essentially nothing to a consulting position where you have responsibility for nothing other than trying to appear smart, into managing a bunch of people. And in my case, it was hundreds of people. And I was scared out of my wits. And what I learned fairly quickly was that more than anything else, the key to my success in doing that was going to be in the people that were one layer below me. That if I got those people right, so many other things would take care of themselves. And I think Mark has done that very, very much at Sondermind. I don't just love great CEOs. I love great CEOs that hire for strength underneath them. And I think within the 90 plus companies that we have supported at Kickstart, the balance of the quality of people at one layer below Mark is among the best we have, top 5 easily. And, that solves so many problems underneath because great people figure out the solutions to big problems. So much can be solved by doing that right. I totally agree with Mark.
Well, Curt, I think there's no better way to sum up this whole podcast on passion and coming together. And I know it's been something that I'm going to be thinking of. And I wasn't even joking. I will listen to this episode on repeat, even though I was part of recording this episode. There were a lot of great takeaways for me. So thank you both so much for being here and joining us today and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you for listening as we dive deep into what it takes to create the perfect pitch. If you want to learn more about our investor, Curt Roberts from Kickstart, or our CEO, Mark Frank, and what he and his incredible team are doing at Sondermind to make mental health care more functional, we'll have a link to the company and a longer bio in our show notes at kickstartfund.com/perfectpitch. We'll be back next time with more insights from entrepreneurs and the investors who fund them, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing.